Guys, welcome to version 10 of the Heroes Lecture Part 2. How many of these am I going to do? I don't even know. I just want to make this thing presentable. And we're still evolving, so version 10 of the Heroes Lecture. This is part 2, version 10 of part 2, I should say. So we did a part 1, which I'm definitely going to redo. But version 2, or part 2. So in part 1, we talked about this phenomenon called the hero's journey. And it's basically, we'll recap it here. So the hero's journey is Joseph Campbell's thesis that there exists in the world a grand narrative. A narrative that's universal. He took a survey of multiple myths and religions from around the world, and he identified consistent narrative patterns. These were patterns, narrative structures that were common throughout multiple cultures, all the stories that they told. This is across all of history, 7,000 years ago, right up until today, the modern era. And he took all those patterns and arranged them into a master narrative. And he called this mankind's one great story. And he really did that to try to engage this postmodern angst that we have so many stories, so many religions. Everyone's got their own little version of the truth. How do we know which one is correct? But in our futility of trying to figure out, sort through, okay, which one is correct? The Bible, the Quran, the Buddhist scripts, the Hindu books that I can't really pronounce. How do we decide, right? We have all these different versions of the truth. And Campbell said, okay, well, hidden in that despair is kind of this, emerges actually some sense of what the truth should be. And the truth should be a story that's accessible to everyone, right? In our despair of saying I don't know which one is the truth, what we're really saying is that if there is a truth, then it should be a story that's consistent across all of humanity. It shouldn't just favor one culture over another. Probably. I think we've all decided that it shouldn't come down to like your eternal salvation, shall we say, should not come down to factors that you couldn't control. You just happen to be born in this country and that's why you're not Muslim. Or you were born in this era and that's why you're not Christian. The truth, in our despair, we sort of implicitly decided that the shape of the truth should be something that's universal. And that's what Campbell tried to engage. That's why he surveyed all these different myths. And he said, look, this is a story that we all tell. And so that's one criteria of the truth. And I think also implied in our search, in the despair of our search, is that whatever the truth is, it should be something that's admirable, that's somehow ennobling, and that's grandiose in scope. For example, you wouldn't necessarily believe a story that says like, oh, the whole purpose of mankind is to just save up for retirement and then die. Like, for example, that's probably not on its own the story that will define us. And so Campbell put together the narrative that he discovered was something that was grandiose. And so in this, I guess, narrative structure, you could call it almost like a summary or a meta structure that combines all the different wisdom traditions together, that in this summary is in fact a grand story, a narrative that's grand in scope. And in some sense, it kind of seeks to define what that is. So I want to talk about a little bit about what that narrative is, and then ways in which we can try to validate this. How do we know this is actually true? So it's a sociological survey. If it's really true, shouldn't it be evident across multiple disciplines? Across multiple forms of analysis, ways of thinking, ways of observing the world. So we'll talk about that. And that's actually the main part of this part too. But so he has this grand narrative, right? And it's grand in the sense that it's universal. That's, it's a survey of all shapes and sizes of cultures and civilizations, from the Greeks all the way down to the Aboriginal tribes in Australia, Amazon rainforest tribes, the Aztecs, tribes in Uganda, or is it Uganda? I think so. Well, anyway, certainly in Africa, from every continent, from 7,000 years ago, and we see evidence of this hero's narrative being told right up until today. And that might be the most shocking thing of all. Because you might think, well, those people, they just didn't have science back then. They don't know what we know now. They didn't know that there's not gods, hurling lightning bolts from the clouds. We know now that it's just electrons doing whatever. I don't really know why. I still don't really know why lightning happens, but it's probably not a naked guy in a toga. So, like, we might want to say that, but actually, the hero's narrative, we covered this in part 1, we're still telling that story. Modern day people tell that story. We don't just tell it. Our culture is centered around it. It is front and center of pretty much all we do. At least in terms of culture, entertainment, in terms of what inspires us. Okay, so right, there's a universality to this narrative structure. It's just you see it everywhere. And then, but what makes it grand in the sense of scope? How does it ennoble mankind? What is the story? Does it grip us? Well, certainly it does. When you think of like narrative structures, when you think about how we connect to the world, we essentially connect to the world through story. Because what is a story? A story is an agent, a main character, and then a setting. And these two things kind of define each other. And when you have an agent and a setting, or a character and a setting, you naturally, a motivation naturally arises, a purpose naturally arises. Those are the components of purpose, of motivation. And meaning and purpose are synonymous. When you're asking, like, why am I here? What am I doing here? What you're asking is, what's my purpose? If you want to ask the question, who am I? What you're really asking is, why am I? So you could think of like the Lion King, where, is it Simba? No, who's Mustafa? Tells Simba when he's out kind of lost in the forest, doesn't know who he is, he goes, remember who you are. Or more accurately, he goes, remember who you are. And if he just remembers who he truly is, then he will know what he needs to do. He will discover his motivation. And it's like purpose is what grips you to the world. It's your bridge to the world. It's how we connect to it. And when we don't have a sense of purpose, what happens? You start to feel you start to drift, right? You start to feel like insignificant, that you don't matter. You get this very light, I guess like kind of a floating, like you're a ghost or something like that. So it's a very uncomfortable feeling. It's sad. So stories are these like motivational structures. And I like this idea of identity and setting. And so it's like, for most people, the world, let's say a modern take of the world, is that the world is just kind of here. We're just thrown into it. And the things that we really want have to do with friends, family, and job. Those are pretty much the three components. Social status, we need to provide for ourselves, and then we wouldn't mind having a little bit of fun, and we need connection, and maybe a sense of like, doing a good job at work, or having a sense of esteem and status from our fellow colleagues. And that's generally the world for most people, I think. It's not particularly transcendent or magical. It's just we're kind of here, and then we try to be a good person, and then like we die, and that's a pretty good life, And you think like, so if that's your conception of the world, then that really kind of defines your conception of yourself. Like, who are you then? Well, I'm kind of just here, I guess, I'm a member of a family, and right, and you're just kind of a normal person. And so your scope of the world really defines the scope of who you are. And in this hero's journey, well, what is the world that the hero's journey describes? Well, the hero's journey it puts the world into two parts. It says that there's like an ordinary world, and then there's a special world. And it's sort of meta-defined. So the ordinary world is the world that you know. This is the world that maybe I just described, right? The world of most people. But it's saying that just behind the veil, if you look close enough, there's this whole other world that's fantastic. That it kind of sits above the ordinary, that it's somehow transcendent, and that this world calls to you. That it's in some sense alive. It's not just an object, but this world is actually a subject. So, the hero's journey, if you're in this world, right, if you conceive of the world this way, then what does it say about you? Well, what it says is that who you are, primarily who you are, is someone who is called to enter into that special world. That's kind of the hero's journey. That's the main premise. And so this is sort of the beginning of his groundwork, or this, I shouldn't say his, I mean, this is just what he's derived from multiple cultures. But what it's trying to say is that, like, you are someone special. This is the shape of the world, right? There's these two different places, the ordinary and the special, and you are actually someone special. And so, like, how does he define meaning, right? Why does he call it grand? What is grand means that it should provide us with some deep sense of meaning and fulfillment. That would be a grand narrative, instead of just like a universal narrative. So a grand narrative, how does he propose to, or how does the narrative propose to give you that, provide you with that sense of deep meaning? Well, it basically says that deep meaning, man experiences deep meaning when he is connected to three different themes. First of all, it has to be epic in scope. Whatever theme it has to be grandiose on a large scale. And we can talk more about that, but basically it has to involve themes of morality, an epic sense of good and evil, themes of deep transformation, some kind of, again, epic, dramatic growth that's significant, something on a large scale, some kind of inner transformation, and then from that transformation, a connection to the divine realm, some kind of connection to transcendence. And that's, again, this is just what the narrative, this is what people have been saying, the stories they've been telling for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Again, even the stories today, we keep telling stories of what? Epic morality, epic battles, cosmic battles of good and evil, deep inner transformation. These are our main characters. When we get home from work, a tough day at the job, and it was horrible, we had this 3-hour meeting, whatever, we turn on Netflix, and this is what we watch, right? We watch a character transform to go through an arc, and then usually he gets in touch with something that is bigger than himself. He learns something that is transcendent. He connects to that, right? And so this is what the narrative says is the meaning of life, that if we experience these three components, morality, themes of morality, inner transformation, dramatic inner transformation, and connection with something divine, something bigger than yourself, maybe even like, right, the source that started the universe, the substance of all reality, right? Can we say that that's epic? I mean, that's so. These three components are necessary for you to affect this experience of deep meaning. So that's the grand narrative, right? It's this narrative that's universal across all cultures, and that it's grand and epic in scope, and that it proposes that morality, inner transformation, and transcendence are the three components of meaning. And that's what people have intuited, from around the world for all time, as far as we can tell. So I want to talk a little bit about narrative in general, and then a little bit more about the scope or the arc of the hero's journey, and then get into different ways we can try to analyze the hero's journey and really try to validate it. Like, is this just a bunch of fairy tales, a bunch of wishful thinking, or can we try to cross-reference this using different domains of study? Not just the sociological, because in a sense, or maybe specifically that Joseph Campbell, his research is inherently sociological. It's just a survey of multiple cultures across, thousands of years to determine, okay, well, what could possibly be, what's actually true here? What are the deep truths of our reality? So it's a grand narrative, right? And so why is it that a narrative is what communicates that deep sense of meaning? Why does it have to be in the shape of a narrative? We touched on it a little bit, but a narrative is essentially, it's kind of like this, I call it like a motivational structure. It's a vehicle of meaning. And when you think of meaning, it comprises actually of two components. I mean, on a very technical level, meaning would be, it's deeply associated with purpose. Because really when you're saying what's the meaning of life, it's kind of like what's the purpose of life. I think those are basically synonymous. And the reason why purpose is such a great summary of meaning or a communicator of meaning is because purpose involves two components. It necessarily involves the actor, the agent, and then that's the person who has the purpose, but then that purpose has to take place in a setting. It has to take place in a world. So purpose, it contains the element of identity and then the element of the world that you're in. So it orients you to the world. So purpose is your bridge to the world. That's what connects you to the world. And when you don't have a purpose, you start to drift. You don't know, you're not attached to anything, and it feels very, very uncomfortable. So narratives are a motivational structure. They're a vehicle of meaning. They're comprised of a character and a world, and those two combine to describe a motivation. Motivations arise out of a character and a world. We ourselves are composed of multiple narratives. We're kind of like nested narratives, and narratives, by the way, right? They're motivational structures. They're purposeful structures, which means that they define our identity. And so we have these nested identities, right? Because there's a person that goes to work. You could think of it that way. You're the employee. This is your relationship to society. And so that's kind of like a master narrative, a master identity. And because, like, beneath the narrative of identity, the narrative of work, you have all these different sub-narratives. There's a narrative of you brushing your teeth in the morning, right? You getting ready for work. There's a narrative of you taking a shower or putting your clothes on, blah, 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 right? All these narratives are nested under the narrative of you going to work, you wanting to go to work. And, like, each narrative, depending on how many narratives are underneath it, that's the amount of meaning that it can provide to you. So, for example, like brushing your teeth, it probably doesn't give you that much meaning. You probably don't conceive of the purpose of your life to be anything close to brushing your teeth. But, it does provide a little bit of motivation because it is connected to the master narrative of you as let's say, a high-functioning employee, someone who contributes to society, right? So that's kind of a narrative that provides a lot of meaning, because a lot of other narratives are dependent upon, like, you going to work, like you have to support yourself and you have to feed yourself, and it's also your sense of status in the world, the esteem that you gain from your colleagues, from your peers. It also probably makes you a member of a family. Like, if you're not working, then it's going to impair your relationships with your family. And for a lot of people, family is maybe a slightly higher narrative than work. It's hard to say, but all these bigger narratives, work, family, friends, these are very high narratives that have multiple narratives beneath them. And one question is like, is there a narrative that's higher than work, friends, and family? And, well, religions and mythologies, I mean, their whole purpose of being is to say, yeah, actually, I think there is. That if your life is simply about work, friends, and family, that's just not going to be enough. If you don't have those epic themes in your life, it just won't, right? And so the hero's narrative, this hero's journey, positions itself as a narrative that's above that. All the things that you do in your life, all these little things that you do, right? Get up in the morning, go to work, get a coffee, hang out with friends, you work out maybe, you take care of yourself, you play games, you go, right? All these different things are nested under these different frameworks. Hanging out with your friends, right? Having lunch with a friend, that's under the friend narrative. And these little things that you do can only provide you with as much meaning as the meaning that you attach to the master narratives. Master narratives control the amount of meaning that you get and all the sub narratives. And so if you hate your job, then guess what? It's going to be pretty hard to get up in the morning, and it probably won't feel very good because you hate your job. You're the master narrative of your job, how you feel about that, the meaning that you attach to that is going to limit the meaning or power the meaning that you get from all those subtasks. And so that's why, if you want more meaning in your life, you probably won't be able to find it in the sub narratives. Oh, I just need to go to more concerts, or I need to have more fun, right? It's kind of like you're sort of attacking, you're trying to fix the sub narratives, but you're not. What you need to do is address the bigger and bigger narratives. And then you probably need to question, like, well, these are my biggest narratives. They don't seem to be working that well. I still feel pretty meaningless and anxious and kind of aimless, right? Lost at sea, kind of empty. Is it because I'm not fulfilling these narratives enough, or is it because these narratives can never provide the sense of meaning that I'm looking for? If I just had a better relationship with my wife, if I just had a better relationship with my friends, if only, I had more money and more status, right? I think famously that, well, certainly money and status. But, even family, it's what all of these mythologies and religions that we've been telling over and over again, and that we continue to tell today in our movies and our novels and on Netflix and our sports, is that there's a narrative that exists that's higher than those things. So that's what the hero's journey, that's where it sits. It's a master narrative under which all those other master narratives should live. That's the proper configuration of your life, that your family, your friends, your job, all of that lives under this grandiose epic narrative involving, right, those epic themes of morality, good versus evil, the epic themes of inner transformation, and this idea of transcendence, that journey into the unknown, into the magical unknown, right? So, right, we have all these nested narrative structures. The hero's journey sits at the top of that, and it kind of follows a very simple pattern. I mean, it's sort of, you could take like a meta narrative of that meta narrative, right? Because the hero's journey is just, it's just narrative themes, like skeletal narrative structures that can be filled with any number of details. You don't have to be from a certain place or a certain time. And the overarching structure, Campbell describes it in three parts. It's departure, initiation, and return. And just briefly, and then we'll kind of move into the second part of the lecture, departure is this idea of what, right? It's based on the construction of the world, that there's the ordinary and then the magical, the known and the unknown. And you need, like, you're being called by that unknown world to leave the known. You're being called, right? And that's your identity then. You are one who is called. So that's the departure. And then there's this initiation. You're called to what, though? You need to, The hero sort of pieces that together, and he suspects that it's part of this grand narrative. Grand meaning that there's some kind of epic morality that you need to step into, a goodness, right? A force for good, but it's like you're not worthy yet. That you don't have the skills necessary to fight the evil, to overcome these barriers or these obstacles. And so you have to undergo this initiation process, these trials. And these trials usually take the shape of self-transformation, some kind of inner transformation. Whether it's slaying a dragon or traversing a great distance or, moving through very difficult terrain, like you have to like surpass these different obstacles. There's terror on one side and then famine on the other. Like you must weave through between those, right? Like you have to navigate catastrophe. What that does effectively is it transforms your character, it brings out something new in you. So it affects inner transformation. That's initiation. You then connect with the transcendent after achieving some level of victory or some level of being. And then you return to your people so that you can channel that energy. You can connect them to that transcendent power, and that's ultimately what saves the world. That's the epic saving of the universe. You're connecting to that originating life source. Again, these are stories. This is how they describe it. It might sound, it does sound fantastical, but everyone tells it, right? So this is the grand narrative. This is the narrative that should be. This structure should be the thing that sits at the top of all your other structures, such that now like your journey with your friends, your narrative with your friends, with your family, with your job, are all in service to or subordinated to this overarching narrative structure, and they are thereby infused with the meaning that comes from this hero's journey structure. So that's sort of the architecture of how the hero's journey proposes to fit in your life. Okay, so that's Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. And it sounds pretty cool, doesn't it? Like, wouldn't that be nice if you were called into this fantastic world and you, like, go through all these different battles and crazy, like, kung fu tests, and then you become like Kung Fu Panda, this elevated being of power, and you vanquish an enemy and then connect with this transcendent power where you can then save your people. It sounds like too good to be true, except that, again, this is the story that everyone seems to be telling. So anyways, is it true, right? Is this like for real, or is this just like, what the hell are we doing? Is this just like, Twilight, or I don't know, is this just a Harry Potter movie, or what's going on here? So how can we validate this theory? How do we know that this thing is true? Does it exist in other disciplines of study? How about other domains of knowledge? How about domains of knowledge that we trust, that are maybe just a little bit more, you could say rigorous than just a sociological survey, than just stories that people tell? The hero's journey is ultimately about man's highest purpose, right? That this highest purpose is what provides the deepest sense of meaning and fulfillment. And so then you could say, well, if this is our purpose, right? What other domains of study discuss our purpose? Well, you could say our physiology, biology does, right? What's the purpose of an organism? How do organisms adapt to their environment? Adaptation is just another way of saying purpose. Or adaptation is the fulfillment of a purpose, the purpose to survive and prosper and, I guess, propagate. And so it's like, okay, well, that's not a bad place to look if we're trying to cross-reference, cross-validate the potential validity of this theory, right? This hero's journey theory, that this is the highest purpose of mankind. This is like the shape of the universe, essentially. Does our physiology support this notion, or do we see evidence of it somewhere? So we're going to tiptoe into that. We're going to try to explore, is there some kind of evidence of the hero's journey within our physiology? Can we find it there? And, of course, like, if we're looking for something, maybe we'll find it, but, it might be interesting. And so, yeah, that's what we're going to talk about. How do we see the hero's journey evident within our own physiology? Well, the first thing we can say is that narrative is essentially how our physiology coordinates itself. So let's talk about that. When it comes to adaptation, right? When it comes to like sort of the macro picture of how we coordinate ourselves with the world, because that's what survival is. It's the successful coordination of yourself with the world for the fulfillment of your goals, for the acquisition of the resources necessary to survive, even prosper, and then propagate, I guess, if you were to say that's the main goal of an organism. And so it's like, well, how do we do that? How does the human do that? And if you want to look at it in terms of that, you can break down our physiology basically into two parts. That it's pretty much mind and body. You could say it's voluntary and involuntary. Those are the two essential pieces of how we're made up. And this duality. So we operate out of a duality. Technically speaking, physiologically, we operate basically out of a duality, and this duality is pretty well documented. Like it's been written about, it's been well storied, movies are written about it, novels, right? Mind, body. People even go so far as to say like this is a reflection of the universe, that the universe operates in a duality. Chaos and order, right? This is order, this is chaos, right? Voluntary, involuntary. Male, female, masculine, feminine. You could say heaven and earth, right? There's all these very epic, grandiose descriptions of this duality, and for our purposes, voluntary and involuntary will do. Now, specifically, what do we mean by that? Well, voluntary refers to, it basically refers to a very specific part of our brain. It's the frontal lobes. You probably know this, the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex, and what's interesting about the prefrontal cortex is that it seems to have evolved out of the motor cortex, because if you kind of look at the brain from the side, it's kind of like it's motor cortex, and then something called the premotor cortex, and then the prefrontal cortex. And so this is where consciousness resides. And there's a few interesting things about this prefrontal cortex that we're going to get into. The first thing to note about the prefrontal cortex is that, again, it kind of evolved out of this motor cortex. And the motor cortex is where we store all of our like encoded movement commands. We store sequences of movements coded by neurons in patterns, and then we just run those patterns. So like when you walk, you're not like thinking left foot, right foot, like it just runs on its own, right? We ballistically execute them, I think. But like you just kind of fire it off and then it just runs, it just goes. It's ballistically mechanized, I guess. And so we have all these movement codes. And we always seek to try to improve our ability to move our body in such a way that we're successful in whatever we're trying to do. And then what happened, though, is that we evolved a premotor cortex. So there's a motor and premotor. And premotor is like kind of this, it's this area of the brain where it's able to visualize, take into account the surroundings, and then try to estimate which code of movements would be the most appropriate given the situation. So that's the premotor cortex, right? And it does that in kind of a primitive way. And then, of course, outside of in front of the premotor, now you have the prefrontal cortex. And so basically the idea is that, so consciousness resides, it basically evolved out of movement, motor, right? The motor cortex. And so you could say in some sense that consciousness is kind of inherently premotor. That that the purpose of consciousness was so that we could fully optimize, select, optimize, prioritize, improve the resulting final movements that we enact in the world. And, there's a number of good reasons for that. I mean, one of them is like, movement is very costly. It's resource intensive. And it's also really risky. Like, if you perform the wrong movement or you don't perform the proper movement correctly, you could die, right? If you're running from a predator and you trip over a stick, like, you didn't coordinate that movement very well. I guess you're dead now. Or it's like if you're trying to forage for food and you think you should go north when the food is really south. Well, now you spend all these resources so that your potential for action has been diminished. And also, now you need even more energy to get to the food, right? So all of these devices have evolved so that your resulting movement choices will be the most optimal. So it's kind of interesting to think about. Consciousness is essentially premotor, like it's a premotor device, and so like a lot of how we evaluate our situation or our sense of well-being is kind of like mediated through a lens of movement. And basically, when we feel good, generally that's because we have this sense of forward motion. So if we're making our way through the world, we're working our way towards a promotion, or we're taking a trip towards a concert we've always been wanting to see, or like I'm on a third date with this girl that I've been checking out or been admiring for years, all of those are conceived as forward motion. We're moving towards or getting closer to the acquisition of a sought-after goal. We're built essentially on a platform of movement. So that's the first thing to note about consciousness. The second thing to note is that the prefrontal is it's like an orchestrative structure. It's you could say it's non-modular. So like there's parts of the brain that they're kind of like they perform a monofunction. So for example, facial recognition, that particular area of the brain is generally thought of as, it's meant to recognize faces. There's really not that much else to it in some sense. But the areas in the prefrontal cortex, the seat of consciousness, it's non-modular, meaning that what it does is it kind of just sits in very specific places where it has access to different parts of the brain, like the memory or the visual cortex or the auditory systems, and it's able to take that information and coordinate it in such a way that it can accomplish a certain function. So, for example, like the orbital frontal cortex, it's been proposed that it has the ability to set kind of like macro goals, overarching goals, abstract goals. For example, like I want to start a family, so I need to go to university so that I can get a good job and I'll be able to attract a woman. Like those are all very abstract notions, and so then my goal then ultimately is to start a family. That's the big macro goal. That's the orbital frontal cortex. And then downstream of that comes these sub goals. You can think of them as sub narratives, where I think the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the dorsolateral cortex, particularly the left side, is the cortex that says, okay, well, those are the goals. Okay, well, here's a string of rules and commands that you'll likely need to accomplish in order to eventually reach that larger macro goal. And so the prefrontal cortex is arranged, again, according to an action structure, a movement structure, and they call it like an action hierarchy. And so like the main plot of the story, the big plot, the grandiose plot, is conceived, let's say, in the orbital frontal cortex. I'm obviously kind of simplifying. And then downstream, that's the top of the action hierarchy. And then just below that are going to be the sub-goals, which let's say is arranged by the dorsolateral frontal cortex, which then breaks it down into a number of rules. Again, all the while accessing all these different sensory organs in the brain. particularly memory, and then particularly your senses. So that's voluntary. Like, this is what you are consciously aware of. This is how you move yourself intentionally through the world. And then the body is going to be all those things that operate below consciousness and that report into consciousness. Hang on here. And so these are the multiple ways in which your prefrontal, right, again, it's non-modular. Your prefrontal is able to generate the information or coordinate the information necessary for you to understand what goals you should set, what rules you need to set, what policy actions. Like, a policy could be, if the crosswalk is red, if it says don't walk, then I shouldn't walk. If it says walk, then I should walk, right? These are different policies, conditional rules. And then you can extrapolate that, like, a hundredfold. If I take mathematics and physics, then that will make it more likely that I'll be able to get into a pre-med program, or, right, these are different policy actions. And so what's happening is, right, your prefrontal is taking all the information from your body, from these different parts of your brain, your memory, your sensory organs, your visual cortex, and it's able to generate these plans, right? It's able to construct representations of the world, representations of yourself, right? It generates these. In some sense, it generates this in the abstract. What you behold before you is a perception, right? And so, I mean, think of it this way: like, when you just come out of the womb, when you're a baby. I remember I took care of a baby once, just once, and I hope to never do this again unless it's mine, because I was terrible at it. My roommate at the time had his niece over, and she was like 2 years old, just playing on the carpet. We're watching like football, and then he leaves for like 10 minutes, asked me to look after her, and I'm like, oh, sure, no problem. As soon as he leaves, I'm like, you know what? I actually don't even know how to take care of a baby. And then suddenly she starts crying, and I'm just like, oh my god. And then I pick her up, and she's just like, just losing it. And I'm just starting to sweat. I don't know. I'm just holding her. I'm just like, what do I do with you? And then eventually he comes back, and he puts her in this cradle or whatever, this little swing thing, and then she stops crying. And so, like, what's happening there is that I didn't know what she needed. I didn't know what her motivation was, you could say. What were her needs in that moment? I don't know that she necessarily knew. She certainly couldn't communicate it. And so basically, this is the idea that, like, when you're born into the world, you're thrust into this condition of pain and vulnerability, essentially. Like, when you have desires but you don't know what they are, they generally announce themselves to you in the form of pain. Like, thirst is a kind of pain. Hunger is certainly a kind of pain. And then, so you get thrust into the world. You're vulnerable. You're in pain. But then there's this outside force. Your mother takes you into her arms, and then she holds you, and then you experience this relief of pain, this sense of bliss, fulfillment. And what's happening there is the brain is, again, consciousness is starting to emerge. It consciousness is starting to emerge, and it's encountering pain, and this, it goes through this iterative process of pain and then relief, pain and then relief, and it's beginning to build this map, right? This map of like this pain was relieved by this sensation, and so it's trying to map, if I want to relieve this pain, then I need to get this particular, right? And then so it's all of your senses are trying to figure out how to deal with the pain. That's the whole motivation. All of your physiology is completely coordinated around trying to alleviate pain. And so you're frantically, or maybe, focused on building out this map. And then you have this sense that what you need is coming from outside of you, right? And so this is how you employ your senses. You're trying to figure out how do I conceive of the world in such a way that I can identify the source, the resources that will fulfill and relieve the pain that I have, or the needs that I have. And then you get the sense too that this is there's something physical about it, that you have to coordinate or arrange your body with the world. So when your mom like breastfeeds you, you have to kind of like intercept. Apparently it's a very complicated process, but like there's a sensory motor aspect where you have these incoming senses, you have this visual cortex to try to see. it's kind of awkward, but try to see how this is happening, the shapes that are coming at you, like this game of Airplane when they have the spoon, and right, that's we map out the world through the sense of play. And so this is fun for the baby because it's like you're learning to see the spoon and then to coordinate yourself so that the spoon lands in your mouth and you get the food, and that, you know what I mean? So you're building out, everything is being mapped out according to the accomplishment of your goals, the fulfillment of your needs. And that's how everything is mapped out. And because you're aware that you live in the world, you know that essentially, inherently, it's movement that's going to connect you to the things that you need. Movement is the bridge between your desires and the fulfillment of your desires. That's like the instinctive understanding that you have as a kid. Because like, you have to coordinate yourself with your mother in order to get the hug, or to be breastfed, or to get the bottle in your mouth, and it's just all sorts of, a number of different sequences are happening inside consciousness to begin to map out these desires. So you begin an interpretive map, this almost treasure map of pain, like an interpretation of all the different sensations that communicate need. And then you're trying to figure out what are the things in the world that match to these needs. I have this thing when I eat the applesauce that relieves this pain, so this is a hunger pain. That means I need to acquire food somehow. So, then there's this whole like separate, this separate process for coordinating the muscles in your mouth to speak, which is insanely complex, apparently. And so all of you is centered around, it's basically a map of desire, which is mapped out onto the physical world and then is connected by movement. Basically, that's how you develop. And you explore these maps, you enlarge these maps, develop and refine and optimize these maps, generally through a sense of play. And then, of course, under the love and care of an adult, of someone who's well developed. And they help you draw those maps. Sometimes those maps can become very distorted if like we all have a slightly distorted map in how we interact with people. But anyways, the basic premise is that you're building this internal representation of yourself. You have this map of the world arranged, your visual cortex arranged such that you can identify the objects of your desire, and that you can kind of play matchmaker, coordinate your desire map with the map of the world. You're trying to find what do you need in here, out there, and it's reciprocal. How how you conceive of the world generally dictates how you conceive of yourself. Like if you're getting food, now you're hungry, like hunger matches to the food. But if what you desire, you can't find it in the world, then that there's like this kind of push and pull with how you conceive of the world and how you conceive of yourself. So anyways, you're building these two maps. And basically that's right. What are you doing there? That's a story. The internal representation of yourself and the internal representation of the map of the world. This is the main character. This is the world that you're in. And then you're building these motivations, these action sequences that's going to bring you to your desire. That's going to bring you the objects of your desire. So your purpose is connecting you with the world. It's figuratively, literally, purpose is what's driving your visual cortex to arrange the world into definable shapes. And the discernment of shapes apparently it's like 14 different modules in your brain that's responsible for determining shape. It's like really complicated. And if you heal a person that's been born blind, like they still can't see shapes because their visual cortex has not been trained to like arrange it into distinguishable objects, into physical objects, such that you can both identify and also navigate a path towards those objects in the world that you need to fulfill your desires. So essentially, like, story, narrative, purpose is what guides your entire physiology. Because your ability to identify, prioritize, and then construct an action sequence to acquire your desires and needs determines your adaptability to the world. Again, you have to identify the needs, prioritize the needs, and then come up with the right sequence of actions over the course of time in order to acquire those needs in the correct order at the right time. That's a story. That's a story. That's your motivation. That's the plot of the story. And then consciousness is responsible, right? It takes all of this information and arranges it into a coherent structure, into sort of like a unified whole, such that you're able to navigate through it. Internal representation, this physical map where you understand space and then you coordinate your body to that space such that you can apprehend the objects of your desire. You're moving through space. And then mapping is pretty difficult because, some of the lower stuff is pretty easy. It's like if I'm hungry, well, I should eat a pizza. Like that's pretty basic, right? That's just a mechanical function. But what if you are well fed and you feel empty inside? You feel anxious inside. You don't know why. Maybe you have a good relationship with your family, or your job's kind of good enough, or you can't really identify any one particular thing. It just feels kind of blah. It's like, this is like the journey of man, right? This is the situation that we're in. The higher up you go on like Maslow's pyramid, I guess you could say, the higher the narrative, the more difficult it is. It's just more difficult to figure out that map. And so that's why we're kind of on this search. So basically, like, just to say, like, narrative sits at the center of our physiology. It is the vehicle for adaptation. Stories, even though they're really fun and entertaining, technically speaking, stories are the way that our physiology coordinates itself. It's centered around a purpose. Again, purpose is how we connect to the world. What does that mean? It's how we get food. It's how we get water. It's how we form bonds with the members of our community such that we are protected and safe, and that we can have access to resources that we wouldn't have had or would have been very difficult to acquire on our own. All of our processes, and again, the visual field's the best example. Like, all of it's completely anchored around purpose. And purpose is a narrative. That you can't have you can't have purpose without a narrative, because purpose implies identity and world. That's a story. And then the narrative is the enactment of that purpose. Now, what's really cool is that the prefrontal cortex, right, it generates these internal representations. Now it can generate multiple versions of yourself. That's why this thing has just grown out. Like it's like this really awesome virtual reality machine where it's able to envision multiple different action sequences, multiple plans. You could think of it like it's envisioning different futures. Story is kind of like it's a potential future. It's like a particular it's like a time structure where it shows someone moving through time in a certain way and then the resulting consequences. How did it work out for this person? This person thought, well, if I just got that amazing job at the investment bank, that would fulfill my deepest needs. And if I end up doing a lot of cocaine and whatever, live this lifestyle, this will give me that deep sense of meaning and fulfillment. And then it's like, okay, well, how did that story go? Or if I just marry this one girl, or right, there's all these different stories about how people have these, that they're a character, they're in this world, their conception of the world, and then they have these motivations, and it's like, well, how do they go about fulfilling that motivation? How do they fulfill that need? Did they identify the object to need bridge properly? Did the thing that they want actually fulfill them? And then it's like, what was the transformation that happened to this character as he pursued this particular sequence of actions in this particular order? And what's also really cool, like, so we can do that for ourselves. It's like, in a simple example, it's like, well, how do I get to the donut shop? And you think, well, if I take the bus, or if I walk, or if I take the train, right? And you're kind of like playing all these different scenarios in your head. And what's interesting is that when you're doing that, the parts of your brain that light up as if you were doing it, light up when you imagine yourself doing it. So that's why when you're watching a movie, for example, when you're watching someone do something, you kind of have these weird tickle, like as if you're doing it. You feel like you're doing it. That's because in a sort of technical way, your brain can't differentiate between narrative and reality. Like, that's how immersed it is in different narratives, because it understands that the better it can simulate the experience, the more accurate the predictive model will be. Like, the more accurate the consequence, or like its mapping of the consequences will be more accurate. And then we go through this process of saying, well, that story is not very realistic, or that doesn't seem like a very good story, that if this person got $1 million and they were so fulfilled and happy just by the money, and it's like, that doesn't seem like that's like the subject of every like rap video in some sense. It's like, I have a friend who, God bless him, like, he pretty much, I just swear, he saw a music video and then he decided that, okay, my life should be that music video. And so he's one of these fortunate, I guess, people that, like, he doesn't work that much. He makes a ton of money, and so like he races cars for a hobby, and then he like just sleeps around with all these women, and he's kind of like this James Bond, but he's not actually saving the world. He's just doing all the James Bond stuff, having fun, and that's kind of his narrative, right? He's decided that that's what's gonna fulfill him. And anyway, so yeah, we all have these different stories that we have. We all have these different stories in our head that we sort of live by, and then sometimes they work, and then sometimes they don't. And so this is all just to say that, like, our physiology is actually centered around narrative, and so it does make sense then that there's probably some narrative structure that might be the most fulfilling, because we understand that we're built of nested narratives, right? And different narratives generally defined by their scope. The scope of the narrative is what determines like the meaning that you get from it. And so like brushing your teeth only gives you so much meaning, or eating pizza only gives you so much meaning, but meeting with friends, that certainly gives you a sense of meaning. And then of course falling in love and starting a family, that gives you a deeper sense of meaning. Um, and then you think, okay, well, what if I got everything I wanted, but I still don't? Or what if I try to get those things and it falls apart on me? What if someone dies? What if someone gets sick? What if I get sick? What if I ruin the relationship? Right? All these different things that could happen to impair your narrative. And if those narratives fail, it's just like, well, shit, what do I do now? Right? And so that's mythology, that's religion, that's what all these stories are for. These are the stories that we elevate into maybe like a sacred space because they control so many narratives. And so like the hero's narrative then is trying to position itself as this is the highest narrative. Like this is the narrative structure under which all other narratives should be orchestrated around. So we kind of have the first piece. Yeah, it seems reasonable that since our physiology, our strategy, our ability to adapt is enacted by is completely fulfilled by narrative. Like the entire strategy is narrative is the only way in which we're able to survive. Well, then the next question is, well, what's the highest narrative? What's the narrative that optimizes our entire physiology such that we are the most successful in the world, that we move through the world in the most adaptive, most prosperous way? And you could define that. The most prosperous way is defined by the amount of meaning that you feel throughout your life. So then meaning is the definition. I mean, maybe we can agree on that. Meaning and fulfillment. Whoever, however you can get the most meaning and fulfillment is what says or defines how successful you are in the world. That even if you get $1 million and marry that beautiful girl and have beautiful kids and all that stuff, but if you feel empty inside, you didn't really adapt that well. At the end of the day, you didn't really adapt that well. The guy who's poor and alone, who is excited and deeply fulfilled and satisfied with his life, actually probably won. He adapted better to the world than you did. So it's kind of definitional, but I think we can sort of agree that meaning and fulfillment is a good barometer for how well we're adapting. And so it's like, okay, well, is the hero's narrative adaptive? Does it actually provide a sense of meaning and fulfillment? Okay, well that will be something that we should look at next. Thanks for listening. All right, guys.